Hi, I'm Jerry Fjerkenstad, and today I wanted to talk about a subject that I think affects the minds of most people these days, and probably their sleep, and that's terrorism. And I've been trying to do some thinking lately about where does that come from? How do we recognize it? Because it seems like it comes out of nowhere and scares the hell out of us, and then we don't know where it's going to come from next time. And so I just felt for my own sake and maybe hopefully helpfully for you as well that finding some ways to think about it could be useful. And when I was doing that, the odd idea that popped up was pop-ups. I think everybody remembers pop-ups on your computer. They still happen. Now they're even more finely tuned to your needs or your desires, but there are things that just pop up and get in the way. Sometimes you want to get to a website and this thing pops up and you got to click it out of the way before you can go on. And it seemed like there was a parallel somehow with terrorism, that their pop-ups, they pop up here, they pop up there, and you have no idea where it's going to happen next. And it seems like the people that are supposed to know what's going to happen next are starting to say, we don't know where it's going to happen next. And that's kind of scary. So I was trying to think, how do terrorists come about, or how do you recognize them, or can you recognize them? And I was thinking a little bit about the internet itself in a different kind of way. And having worked a lot with sex offenders and people in sexual trouble, I know that the internet had a profound effect on people sexually. It used to be if you wanted to look at bad things sexually, you had to get in your car and go to a special store and be very careful going in and out of there because you didn't want anyone to see you. And if you ran into someone you knew in the store, that was kind of okay because neither of you was going to rat on the other one. But it was a thing of kind of shame and hiddenness. And then the internet came along, and now people can go online and find almost anything they can even imagine. They don't have to leave their house. They don't have to expose themselves. They don't have to take any risks, at least they think so. And you can even have your wife and children sleeping in the same house while you're going through some bizarre sexual world. Now, I think the same thing kind of applies to people that end up being terrorists, because I think it used to be that someone could feel kind of invisible, meaningless, and they would just sort of fade away over time. They were just lost in space. But now there's the internet, and the internet has this ability to connect with fragments here and there, people who are looking for meaning or significance or something to attach themselves to, and people who feel like there's nothing around them that lends them any meaning or credibility. So they're kind of hungry for something. And so you can have someone thousands of miles away hook into something on the internet, act independently, go out in a flash, and feel pretty good about themselves, make a big splash, make a big mess, and that seems kind of frightening. One of the most terrifying shows on TV that I've seen in the last few years was one called The Following. And the premise of it was a rather charismatic, antisocial, serial killer kind of guy gets out of prison and he starts committing terrorist acts. And he has a kind of vibrant website that kind of excites people that are isolated in different ways. And he can make things happen in faraway places. He can have people planted right in the middle of a normal situation, and suddenly one day they just rise up and something happens. Similar to the thing that happened in California at the party at that agency where this man and his wife just came in and shot everybody. And up until that point, they'd been thought to be kind of normal, but they had had a different connection through the internet. Now, the other day on NPR, Minnesota Public Radio, they were talking about some of the ISIS-connected guys that committed the explosion in Brussels and the shootings in Paris. And they were saying that they had criminal resumes, had spent time in prison. And that seemed kind of odd at first. And then it went on to say that in some ways, in terms of ISIS, that actually made them more attractive because they had certain skills and abilities and a certain mindset. Now, however they got to that point, it's sort of like in that context, they're suddenly recognized or seen. Now, it might seem odd to you, what's feeling seen got to do with being a terrorist, or feeling invisible? What's that got to do with being a terrorist? And I thought, what's the most common way people feel insignificant or invisible? And I thought, well, it's probably how your ex looks at you sometimes. That there's a certain kind of look that just makes you feel like you're not there, or whatever you are is not very desirable, or it should vanish from the face of the earth in order to improve mankind. Something like that. And I think that's something a lot of people have either experienced or seen. And then I thought, well, where else does invisibility come up? And I thought, oh yeah, vampires. And maybe this is a little twist on the vampire story, but I think almost everybody knows that when the vampire looks in a mirror, he doesn't see anything. He's not there. And I thought, well, what does that really mean psychologically? Well, I was trying to think, when do people become vampires? When do they reach that point in their life where they're willing to go out and take what they want, harm others without blinking an eye, etc.? Well, maybe it's when they look in the mirror and see nothing. And sometimes that mirror can be other people, or the society they live in, or the world that they're part of, that they've become invisible. And I think people really need recognition. They really need to feel part of something. They need to feel welcome. A lot of people, when you come home and you see your partner, you like to see a smile. You like them to say something encouraging, or that they're glad to see you. So there's something about being invisible that is connected to being a vampire. And you'd have to say a vampire is a terrorist of some kind. Now, another way to look at it might be, how does a normal boy, in this case Bart Simpson, end up one day being like Sideshow Prison Bob? How does that really occur? And I think Sideshow Prison Bob is definitely a terrorist because he comes with a nuclear bomb and a detonator, and his basic attitude towards life is, I don't like something, I'll just blow us all up. And it's like, on TV, Sideshow Prison Bob can be kind of funny. He's just one of the characters. But I think it also says something about life. When people feel invisible, when they don't feel seen, when they don't feel like life really has a place for them, that the direction of things are going means they're insignificant, it seems more likely they can go in this direction. There's nothing left to lose. I'm not valuable to anyone. And then to find out that you can be valued for your hatred, your anger, your bomb-making skills, your ability to break into a building, any of those kinds of things suddenly means that I belong to something. At least for those moments, I can find a niche. There's someone who looks at me and sees something of worth. I don't have to feel just discriminated against. I can actually feel like I got a sense of meaning. And I don't know if that all makes sense, how that transition might happen, but I notice sometimes too that sometimes when some of our esteemed politicians go on television, they make a statement like, I'm speaking for all Americans. And sometimes I go, well, I don't agree with that. You're not speaking for me. So it made me think of Hermes Web. This is Hermes Web. This is a tool I use to just talk about human beings and all the different parts of us, our mind, our body, our spirit, our intellect, all that kind of stuff, and the place in us where they all intersect, the core. That core is kind of a powerful place because it does connect all those. And sometimes then, because of that, we use this barrier. The barrier is something we put in place so we can start to separate out a part that we can control more, have more of a handle on, and kind of push down out of sight those things that are more difficult to deal with or figure out or make us uncomfortable. And sometimes when that stuff is pushed down long enough and hard enough, it starts to kind of boil and fester, and it can flip up. And when it flips up, then all of a sudden it's all there, and it's kind of a mess, and you don't know what to do with it, and maybe it makes some trouble, maybe it doesn't, but you try to get it to go back down. You can kind of restore that peace you have with yourself and the world, and don't have to think about those things again, and hope they don't start popping up, because if they pop up, you kind of like to push them down and just keep things on an even keel. So it made me think of the Hermes Web and how sometimes put a barrier here, and in most people, most situations, what's above the barrier is who we are, and what's below the barrier we often ignore, our conscious and our unconscious, our visible and our invisible. Now, when a politician is speaking for all Americans and saying this is what Americans want, that means that anyone who doesn't want that is down here, below the barrier, having less significance, second class, whatever you want to call it. And I think it's very difficult for people to just take that role and not feel anything. When you look at American politics today, it seems like what makes it kind of hot, exciting, vibrant, whether it's healthy or not, is that a lot of people have felt that for some time, like our politicians, our government isn't really looking out for me. I'm invisible. The things that affect me in my daily life don't get much attention. Nothing happens. So when someone can speak for that that's usually invisible and usually cast off, usually ignored, that's a powerful connection. And that's the same kind of connection, I think, that leads to terrorism. When I'm not part of this world, I need to do something to make myself visible. I need to do something to make a statement. It can be ugly, it can be violent, it can be horrible. I can, like Sideshow Prison Bob, blow myself up to smithereens. But I have sent a message. I haven't just disappeared. Now, I remember when I worked in the prison, I had some conversations with some of the older prisoners who were lifers, we called them, and they were talking about the younger prisoners. And they were saying, it just isn't the same anymore. There used to be at least some sense of honor. The younger prisoners don't really play by any of the old rules. They don't care what happens to them. They maybe making a statement means more to them than whether they're healthy or alive. And that's a different kind of state. What it takes to push people to that point, it's hard to say, but I think everybody has a limit. Paul Douglas, our local weatherman, recently gave a talk, I think at the Westminster series. It's noon speeches at a church downtown during the week. And one of the subjects that came up was the oceans. And he talked about how 90% of the heat generated by our human activity on Earth these days gets absorbed by the ocean. And one thinks, well, that's probably a good thing. And I think it is to a point, but at what point can't it absorb anymore? At what point does it start to give birth to things that are quite unpleasant, like the storm of this century, the biggest storm ever seen, more storms in a season than has happened before, or the ocean is too warm to support these kinds of fish, the lobsters start to die, etc., etc. There's always a limit to what things can absorb. And I think that's part of what gives birth to terrorism, that sense that as long as something keeps absorbing it, as long as people can keep swallowing it, as long as people can take it, let's keep pushing it. Let's not deal with this. Let's not deal with that. As long as we're prosperous here, let's not worry about those millions and millions of people over there that have nothing to do and have done that because they're chasing a dream of a certain kind of life that they really can't attain, but which we're saying that's the only good life there really is. That's what really works. So those are some of the things that come to mind for me when I think about terrorism and think about how terrorism is becoming more terrifying. It used to be, like with 9/11, it took a big operation with a lot of details and a lot of preparation and a lot of people involved and a lot of money and training. But that isn't necessarily so anymore. It's these little things way out in the middle of nowhere, or people that we consider insignificant, who, trolling the internet, find something that gives them a purpose in the moment, a way to go out. And I think that's what we have to start paying attention to. Too often when terroristic things happen, people around us say, I didn't see that coming. I had no idea that that person felt that way. It's like we have great hindsight, but we don't know how to see very well now. And I think we need to get better at seeing what's going on down here, seeing the whole picture, rather than trying to make this as good as possible. We need to figure out, how do these two realities coexist? How do they balance out so that some people, some things don't get pushed down here into a second-class role, and at some point just can't absorb anymore, and things start popping up. Things start coming up into this world up here that was formerly peaceful, and it's suddenly not so nice to live there anymore, and there's no place to run, no place to hide. So maybe that'll make it harder to sleep tonight, thinking about that. But I think it's good to think about it, because it seems like a problem that's only going to get worse, not get better, unless something changes, unless we change how we think, how we see things. So, thanks.